Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is David Theroux, and I am the founder and president of the Independent Institute, which has produced the film that we are premiering worldwide here tonight, titled Beyond Homeless, Finding Hope. The Independent Institute is a nonpartisan public policy research and educational organization that commissions in-depth studies into causes of seemingly intractable challenges and task our fellows with developing demonstrated solutions. While we are nonpartisan and non-politicized, we regularly provide our peer-reviewed results in the research to policymakers across the aisles. For example, we have produced numerous books on housing, and related to this evening's topics of affordable housing and homelessness, we provided a study of an inclusionary zoning to the City of Oakland's Blue Ribbon Commission when Jerry Brown was mayor that resulted in its being rejected as proposed legislation. Later, as governor, Jerry Brown drew again on this study's findings to veto a proposed statewide inclusionary zoning. Our mission is to boldly advance peaceful, prosperous, and free societies grounded in a commitment to human worth and dignity. And there are few greater affronts to human dignity. Our film is also the companion to an in-depth policy report we recently issued titled Beyond Homeless, Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes, Transformative Solutions. Incidentally, a copy of the report and as an executive summary of it are on the thumb drive that you're given on your way in. And on the drive is the trailer to the film, as well as several op-eds adapted from the film and the policy report, news releases, and a complete visual description of the Salvation Army's ambitious initiative called The Way Out. Following our film, which is 38 minutes long, we will be having a panel discussion moderated by Heather Knight of the San Francisco Chronicle, and including many of those interviewed in the film. Our campaign for housing and human dignity has been a years-long labor of love by my wife, Mary Theroux, and her great team, and we're very grateful to be able to share it with you tonight. As Mary says in the film, this unnecessary tragedy has been unfolding for far too long, and it is high time we came together in community to reverse it. We hope that the film can be a catalyst for that change. Thank you very much again for joining with us for our world premiere of Beyond Homeless.
San Francisco, the city by the sea.
California really was the Golden State when I arrived in the 70s. The streets of San Francisco were vibrant, free, and filled with hope. Now my beloved San Francisco has become known as ground zero for our nation's homelessness crisis.
Things are worse now for the homeless than ever.
San Franciscans have reached a tipping point.
After 40 years of failed approaches to reverse homelessness here, these once hopeful streets are filled with despair and brokenness. And until we tackle this problem, this will be our narrative.
There isn't enough drug treatment for everybody in the city.
What are you doing with all this money that has been allotted to the city? Where's that going?
So there's almost no development that anyone has a legal right to do in California.
We have pitted the smallest differences against each other.
You cannot arrest this issue away. You cannot arrest homelessness away.
Nobody is doing anything transformational.
Leaving people untreated is murder.
We're throwing vast resources at this issue, and it just keeps going up. Really? We can't come up with anything better than that?
Beyond Homeless, Finding Hope is an exploration of what's driving the homelessness crisis here in California, and a look at alternative approaches around the country that offer hope with real solutions. Join us in changing the narrative of our nation's homelessness crisis.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now turn to our panel discussion with a number of those featured in the film. We are quite delighted that our panel this evening is being moderated by Heather Knight, a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, and who has written extensively on homelessness, including a recent poignant profile of a man she had followed for 3 years, who recently and tragically succumbed to a drug overdose. She also co-hosts the Chronicle's Total SF podcast and is co-founder of its Total SF program to highlight the rather upbeat, whimsical side of San Francisco. So let's now welcome our panelists, who are in alphabetical order. Scott Ackerson is a licensed master social worker and the former campus director of Haven for Hope of Bexar County in San Antonio, Texas. Gabriel Badanucci is CEO and chairman of the Urban Vision Alliance, who has over 20 years of previous experience building startups, including at Singularity and the Virgin Group. Theo Ellington is director of homelessness initiatives and community development at the Salvation Army in San Francisco, where he leads the strategy and implementation of the Army's redevelopment of its programs to realize the Way Out initiative. Adam Sovers is a research fellow at the Independent Institute, an editor of our policy report and forthcoming book titled Beyond Homeless, Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes, Transformative Solutions. Mary Theroux is senior vice president at the Independent Institute and executive director of the Beyond Homeless Initiative. She's the former chair and currently serves on the boards of both the San Francisco and Alameda County Salvation Armies, as well as being a member of the Army's National Board. Paul Webster served as senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development with a specific focus on homelessness assistance programs, and now heads up the Hope Street Coalition with a special focus on homelessness, mental illness, and addiction. And Thomas Wolfe, who was formerly homeless in the Tenderloin and as a now recovering heroin addict, has become a strong advocate for a new approach to the homeless and drug crises in San Francisco and beyond. I'd like to welcome our panelists. Heather?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Mary, congratulations on your film.
Thank you.
I think we all learned a lot. What inspired you to take on this project and produce this film? It seems like a very big undertaking and a huge topic.
Am I on? Yeah, okay, thank you. It's really the result of the two hats that I regularly wear. One is as a longtime board member and volunteer with the Salvation Army, and then my work with the Independent Institute in Public Policy. So for the past several years, I've served on the Salvation Army's task force that's been developing the Way Out initiative. And one of my first assignments was to provide briefings to the committee of the causes of homelessness and factors contributing to it. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized this is an incredibly complex issue with a lot of nuanced factors. And it's not just housing, it's not just addiction, it's not just mental illness, it's a whole lot of things. So Independent Institute decided to undertake a policy report to look into all of these complicated factors feeding the homeless and housing crises in the Bay Area and California, and importantly, to propose solutions, which is what we like to do. So that's what we worked on, and again, the policy report, a copy of it is on the thumb drives that you all got or you can get on your way out. The documentary really is the story of what we learned along the way. And I think first, and maybe most important, is that homelessness is intensely personal. It's very individual. So Cooper's story is much different from Vince's, and Lamanda's story is a lot different from Gorilla's, and all the other stories that didn't make it into the film. But each of them is an equally valued and loved creation who deserves an opportunity to achieve their full God-given potential. And the second thing we wanted to do with the film was to cast a vision that the way things are is not the way they have to be. So as I mentioned in the film, I traveled around the country and I visited a lot of programs, and there are a lot of great programs around the country that are achieving a lot of good. But the difference with Haven is it's achieving difference at scale. An entire city, a city that's twice the size of San Francisco, that had homelessness numbers similar to ours, and they've achieved tremendously positive impact. And I think the way they've done it is the most important lesson, because it involves every sector of the community coming together in really a virtuous circle that feeds back to the community and learns and improves and so on. So I think bottom line is homelessness can't be solved by City Hall. It can't be solved by the police. It can't be solved by any one nonprofit. I mean, it really takes a village, literally, except it can't just be kumbaya, you know, we all come together. It has to be strategic. It has to be systemic. It has to have leadership and organization that's accountable to the community, accountable in terms of actually transforming lives, and accountable in terms of actually creating a community in which all of our residents can enjoy the use of our public spaces equally and safely. So it's been a real journey, and we look forward to working with a lot of people and hopefully turning this into a new direction in San Francisco. So thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you. And Scott, you heard in the movie, I think it was Theo, who talked about how the smallest differences here in San Francisco become these huge blow-up fights, and I write about this a lot in my column, that even in such a narrow political spectrum here in San Francisco, we managed to find something to fight about. How did you get over that with Haven for Hope, and how did you bring everybody together?
Well, as Mary kind of said, it didn't start out as kumbaya. We had some of the very similar issues. We had a lot of turfism, territorialism, a lot of competition for funding, but it really took leadership. You heard from Bill Greehey in the documentary, partnering with the city of San Antonio, partnering with the county. So it took that level of leadership to actually bring the nonprofits to the campus. It didn't stop there. There was still some silos. We brought these 70 organizations onto the campus, and what I recognized when we got there is we took 70 silos from the community and put them into 22 acres. So we really set about engaging in conversations, inviting the nonprofits into conversations. And these conversations weren't about funding. They weren't about whose territory is this. It was really about transformation and innovation. How do we do things differently to achieve different results? Too often we kind of have the definition of insanity, that we continue to do things the same way and expect different results. We kind of threw that to the wind and changed the way that we operated in San Antonio. And it wasn't just the nonprofits. We had PD, we had EMS, we had the hospitals. Homelessness is a systemic problem, and it needs to have a systemic solution. The other factor that we brought in is on the campus, we hired a person that was solely responsible for partner relations. When I was over partner relations on the campus, I often would equate it to a marriage. You have to pay attention to the relationships every single day to keep them successful. The other factor that we found when we brought all these 70 nonprofits onto the campus, we learned that many were operating under different modalities, different ideologies, and so this really gave us an opportunity to really look at best practices and evidence-based practices and bring those to the campus in a holistic way. And I think that's what really helped to improve us. It was not an easy process. It probably took us 2 to 3 years to get there, but the outcomes speak for themselves.
I was wondering if you can describe logistically where in San Antonio this is and how big is this campus?
Sure. So the campus is just adjacent to the downtown area. It was actually abandoned warehouses prior to Haven being there. The city acquired the land, and then Bill Greehey took leadership in raising the capital to build the campus. It was a $100 million campus, and this was at a time in 2009 when the HEART Act was being implemented, which basically repurposed federal dollars away from emergency shelter into permanent housing solutions, which they called the Housing First solution. So while the rest of the country was downsizing or eliminating emergency shelter, San Antonio spent $100 million to build Haven for Hope, which was a shelter on steroids, and you saw it. That's really the reason that San Antonio is not having the same issues as many of the metropolitan areas across the United States, because while everybody else was downsizing, we built up, and instead of doing things the same way, tried innovation and tried to do things different.
And Theo, as a teenager, you made a short film that talked about the collaborative process needed for dealing with homelessness. And how do you see that actually becoming reality in San Francisco, where we know it's so hard to get anything done here.
Sure. I think, I hope that film never escapes me. It's been high school and it's been a minute now, but not a lot has changed. If you look at what's happening in the landscape here in San Francisco, there's sort of two schools of thought that come to mind. The first is that government can't solve this crisis alone. It's going to take the private sector to do what it does best. It's going to take the public sector to do what it does best and not sort of get in the way or make things more difficult for community-based organizations. It's going to take service providers working in collaboration and not in silos. And the other thing is we talk about San Francisco as if it's sort of the only city around. It's also a regional issue. It's going to take other cities sort of doing their fair share to address the crisis. So I think it's a multifaceted approach, but it's really going to take intentionality. And I think what you saw in the film and by the work that's being done by the folks here on stage is that intentionality piece is key.
Mm-hmm. I know that you know this well, that so many of our services and shelters and everything for homeless people is based in the Tenderloin because other neighborhoods consistently fight them going into, their neck of the woods. So that makes it harder for, say, someone trying to recover from a drug addiction when they're walking past dealers every day to get to their recovery spot. So how do we get over that and convince the rest of San Francisco to pull their weight?
Sure. Well, I think I mentioned earlier the public sector, right? So I think it's the city's job, obviously, to build roads and bridges and hospitals and take care of public safety. But that's the lane that they have to stay in, right? It's allowing land use controls to be favorable to build more housing, right? It's community-based organizations integrating services and not working in silos. So it's everybody sort of staying in their lane and figuring out who does what best and allowing them to fully operate.
But how do we convince regular residents to not fight every time a shelter stays?
Well, that's the tough part, right? I mean, we've all know that we want solutions to homelessness, but nobody wants the shelter that lives that's going to be across the street from their where they live or where they work or where they play or where they eat. So it's going to take some creative land use controls. It's going to take policy. How many folks here want a shelter across the street from their house? Just by show of hands. Yeah, see, I'm putting it to test, right? It's a difficult question to ask and it's a difficult question to answer. So it's going to take force. It's going to take looking at things like CEQA. It's going to take, again, each of those entities and each of those industries operating in their own space. And then something eventually has to give, right? This is the most visible crisis that we see when we walk in the city and county of San Francisco. No matter what neighborhood you're in, no matter what district you're in, you see folks who are unhoused living on our streets. We can't continue to allow that to happen.
Hey, Heather, could I just jump in for a minute?
Yeah.
And Scott could talk to this better, but the point of not wanting a shelter in your neighborhood is because often the people running the shelter will not take responsibility for the people they're housing or for the safety of the people in the neighborhood. The difference with Haven is they have a massive security department that's well-trained to deal with the population. They have to break up a lot of fights internally, but they take total responsibility and accountability for the safety of the people on campus and for the safety of the people surrounding the campus. And the San Antonio police people I talked with said that the neighborhood it's in now is actually safer than it was before Haven was built. So that's the point, is shelter operators have to have that kind of accountability and responsibility, and then maybe we would welcome them next door.
Well, and also I think we need to show people that shelters are not necessarily going to be the same as the ones that are operating now. If you can show a positive example like Haven, that you can get more buy-in because people will see that it can have a positive effect in the community rather than a deleterious one.
And Gabriel, how are your efforts going in trying to bring San Franciscans together on this topic?
We have learned some of the same lessons that Scott learned down in San Antonio. It is difficult, but at the same time, we've also encountered a whole group of people that were not engaged, haven't found a way to become engaged, and we're excited to contribute in some way. And we've been able to unlock resources in the form of people, time, capital, et cetera, that make us optimistic that by continuing to expand on this model, that we can try to get to those broad private-public coalition that you really need to do very large transformative things.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, can you talk about the importance of the wraparound services and what people can access at Haven for Hope, rather than just a roof over their head? What else is there, and can you speak to the importance of all of that being available right off the bat?
Yeah, so one of the lessons learned is homelessness is not a homogeneous phenomena, so our responses can't be homogeneous. There's many causes of homelessness, trauma, finances, illness, and those types of things. So everybody's situation is different. And you heard from Kenny Wilson in the documentary that talked about, while we have a large program that serves 1,700 people, we have 1,700 individual programs that are tailored to the individual and their particular needs. When the campus opened, we opened more with sort of a behavior modification model. We quickly learned that that didn't work and began to incorporate evidence-based practices. So it really incorporated a recovery orientation. We did a 18-month peer support integration leadership program. When the campus opened, 0% of the staff were certified peer supports. Now about, I think, 35 or 40% of the staff on the campus are people with lived experience. So it's really taken what people know and those that have navigated the system and used them to help others navigate the system.
And Gabriel, I was wondering if you could address the issue of do we need more emergency shelter, when there was a little clip of various mayors we've had in the past, and Gavin Newsom, now governor, talked about how he wanted to hopefully get rid of emergency shelter because that wouldn't be necessary anymore if we had enough permanent supportive housing. Where do you stand on that now? It seems like that idea has kind of been deemed unrealistic, to have no emergency shelter.
Yeah, I mean, we see these swings, right, where shelters were bad, and then people saw that if you allowed people to bring their pets, partners, and possessions, that they play a very important role in the entire ecosystem. And I think we're seeing the same thing with transitional or interim housing. For a long time, people said transitional doesn't work. But really, the new transitional is different from the old. Old transitional, you had kind of these strict deadlines where you were out in 6 months, and there was this ticking clock that didn't really provide the psychological safety and feeling of home to work on yourself. People went through the same exact program, no matter what your problems were. And I think transitional has evolved to the point where people can stay for years, and now really, as you heard Scott describe, the programs are really designed around the individuals. And I think everyone's starting to realize now that transitional has an important critical role to play. And now we're seeing that swing back the other way, which is really important and great.
Can I add something there?
Sure.
I will say that Gabriel and I went out maybe 2 years ago when we were sort of evangelizing the idea of the Salvation Army's project, and folks literally laughed in our face when we said transitional housing.
Yeah, they did.
So 2 years later, as we kept pounding the pavement, I'm not going to take full responsibility for it, but the tide is definitely changing, and I think there is a silent majority that you asked a question earlier about what do we do to get people to change. I think there's a sort of silent majority of folks that are living in San Francisco that are fed up with the status quo. I think we saw that last night.
Not so silent.
not so silent anymore,
Yeah.
right? But we've seen San Francisco try different approaches. We saw Care Not Cash a while back. We saw vacancy controls. We saw, making it illegal to sit on sidewalks and in public parks. So something eventually has to give. And I think we can't let up. And I think this, what we're doing at the Salvation Army and what folks are doing at the respective organizations here on stage is allowing different innovative approaches. And it's the city's role really to allow for that and to make space for that.
And I'll add that we're seeing that data from different organizations, that when people stay for 2 to 3 years with workforce training and wraparound services, that you got above those 90% success rates. And if you think about it, it makes sense. When you go to college for 4 years, it's not permanent, but they don't call it college shelter. They call it college housing, because it is your home while you're rebuilding your life. And so that's the way we should be thinking about these transformative places to live as well.
Tom, we were talking beforehand about the current status of shelter in San Francisco, and I wondered if you could just educate the audience on where things stand COVID-wise in that regard.
Well, that's a great question. So first of all, there's, as it stands prior to COVID, there was only about 30% occupancy in shelters for the actual total homeless population in San Francisco. Add in COVID, and that number got reduced almost to zero during COVID. And now, as we're starting to relax restrictions, they've raised the capacity up to about 60% occupancy. So on any given night, so for example, right now there's an emergency declaration in the Tenderloin neighborhood right now because of the drug crisis, the homeless crisis, and they opened this linkage center, right? And the whole idea of the linkage center was to connect people to services, which is a great idea, right? But there's nowhere to send anybody. So they've served 4,000 people in the last 2 weeks, right, that have come in and gotten food, hot meal, bed, not a bed, like blankets, shower, bathrooms, and sign up for maybe some type of service, put their name on a waiting list for a shelter, and the shelter wait list is 1,000 people long. So this is what we're facing in San Francisco. We're facing the same type of situation in Los Angeles. Los Angeles has a few more resources, but they also have 74,000 homeless people in Los Angeles County. San Francisco has anywhere from 8,000 to 17,000. They're about to do a count next week on the homeless, so we'll know more about that. But you can see, the lack of resources that are out there. So as we talk about innovation, we also have to talk about just the sheer lack of resources that are out there to help people. San Francisco has a population of 800,000 people, as an example. 25,000 people, they estimate, are drug users, active drug users in San Francisco. And the Department of Public Health has 500 drug treatment beds for the whole city and county of San Francisco. So when we talk about resources, that's where we're lacking, and that's a big reason why we're struggling right now in the city and why we need systemic change, like Theo was talking about, creating programs, creating pathways for people to not just find recovery, but to get off the street and recover from homelessness, in addition to addiction and other issues that they may struggle with.
And even before the pandemic, you could call 311 if you were homeless and get on a waiting list, but that was usually 1,000 people long. And I'd check it every now and then. You could see not people's names, but their ages and how long they'd been on the list. And there were sometimes people in their 70s and 80s who were on the waiting list for months.
That's right. That's right.
And now you can't even get on that list. And I've talked to people who work in emergency rooms at hospitals and treating homeless people for medical conditions, and when they release them, there's nowhere to send them either. So it's back to the street.
And one of the things that we need to focus on too is, so we talk about permanent supportive housing in San Francisco. There's something called coordinated entry. When you want to go get permanent supportive housing and you're homeless, you go to coordinated entry and you sign up for housing. Well, that process takes months or years. Because first of all, you have to qualify, you have to fill out a bunch of paperwork, meet with a case manager, get assessed. They run an algorithm of your needs, and then based on your needs, if you're homeless enough, you get on the list. Mm-hmm. Now, I was only homeless for 6 months. 4 years ago, today, I was sleeping on the street in San Francisco. I was not homeless enough to get on that list for housing. That's something that we need to change as well. So there's some systemic breakdowns along the way. So having private organizations like the Salvation Army step in and offer transitional step-down housing is a huge key to a void that needs to be filled right now in San Francisco.
And Paul, obviously this isn't just San Francisco specific. Why do you think cities around the country are having such a hard time figuring out how to deal with homelessness, and why is it going up in so many places?
There's an old adage that economists like to say, and that is incentives matter. And a lot of times people on the local level, because homelessness is such it's a visible problem locally. And what do people do when they see things visibly locally? They call their city council members or their county supervisors here in San Francisco or their mayors, and they say, you've got to do something about this. Well, what people don't realize often is that there's a whole regulatory and statutory regimen of federal policy that is incentivizing what we're currently seeing. So some of the things that communities can do to help with that is to understand what the intention is of the federal government and what HUD's intention is. And real quickly, two really significant foundational principles of the current federal homelessness assistance program is first, that people are homeless because they can't afford the rent. And while that's true in a number of circumstances, what most people see, particularly on the West Coast, when they see folks that are in distress on the streets, that are in public psychotic states, that are nodding because of serious addiction to very potent synthetic drugs, is that this is not an issue of rent in economics. This is an issue of behavior. So that the first thing that that communities need to do is understand that there's some incentives, and the incentives are to address homelessness from an economic perspective. And the second thing that's somewhat tied to that is this concept, this assumption that if you provide housing and services, then there will be fewer people suffering on the streets. That is the logic model that exists in the federal policymaking scheme. And I know that we have more housing capacity than ever in our country. We have more funding to support homelessness assistance programs, and yet we see more and more people suffering on the streets. So I think it's important for people to understand what the incentives are trying to accomplish, and then what they can do at the local level to try to create their own incentives and to try to actually meet the actual need, whether it's economic or behavioral or some other kinds of challenges, health challenges, mental illness challenges, and be able to devise and have the flexibility and the innovation to actually achieve and make progress towards those issues that they're seeing on the streets.
And Adam, do you agree with that? And if you were homeless czar, what is one policy change that you think would have the greatest impact on homelessness?
Well, yes, I certainly agree. As you've heard several times on this panel and in the documentary as well, the problem of homelessness is so difficult because there are so many different causes. And as Paul said, some of them are economic, some of them are substance abuse or mental illness or other traumas. And it seems crazy to me that for years now we've had this housing first only policy. Housing first may work perfectly well for some people, but it's not going to work for everybody. People are different. They respond to different incentives. They have different problems, underlying problems that led to their homelessness or keeping them homeless. And to put all of our eggs in this one basket, in this, all or nothing solution, it's just a one-size-fits-all problem is not going to work. We really need an all-of-the-above type solution, and we need places like Haven, and we need transitional shelters. And if you're, I think that the government is not necessarily the best place to solve these types of problems because as with trying to solve other problems, you have a monopolistic bureaucracy that stifles innovation and is not very receptive to, for example, if you have a nonprofit organization, they have to show results in order to get people to contribute to their cause. With a government agency, you just, in some ways, if the problem keeps getting worse, it's better for them because you just keep pouring more money in it, and then you create this kind of entrenched interest that only wants to do things this one way because that's the way the government's doing it. All that said, if you are going to have government funding, you shouldn't be disadvantaging these other transitional shelters and others that are taking different approaches that have had some success. Just to give you an example, there's a place called Solutions for Change down in San Diego County. And because of the federal Housing First mandates for grants, they had to forego $600,000 a year. Now, after that happened, the state came down because California passed a law saying we are only going to give out grants for places that are following this Housing First model. So if you are running a transitional facility, you cannot, for example, require sobriety. You can't do drug testing. You can't compel people to participate in certain services or programs as a condition of remaining in that program. And so they faced a situation where they had built some of their facilities for permanent supportive housing. They had built it years before California decided to make this policy change. And so they had some people living there that were receiving Section 8 housing vouchers. And they were told, you're not going to get any more money because you're not following this housing first rule. And so they had to discontinue a very successful program that they had. They had a 1,000-day program. They were still able to offer it on some of the transitional housing that they're doing. And they're able to offer it on a voluntary basis for people in the permanent supportive housing. But it's kind of a cautionary tale on, the strings that come with some of the government funding. In terms of other things that we could do, I guess getting to what Paul was saying, if you want to solve the problem quickly, I don't want to say the easiest because these are all very difficult problems, but I guess the relatively low-hanging fruit would be some of the economic issues for people that, for example, just lost their job. That was actually the #1 reason cited in the San Francisco homeless count and survey in 2019. It was about a quarter of those surveyed said that loss of the job was the primary reason that they were ending up on the streets. So for those types of things, we can change housing policies, and this should be, as I say, the relatively easy part of the equation. There are so many policies that we have that make housing less affordable in California, whether it's zoning, you have urban growth boundaries, you have affordable housing mandates, or you have to have a certain percentage of your units in your development be below market rate. All of these things serve to make housing more costly to build and less profitable. Well, that creates less of an incentive to build housing in the first place. And when you have less supply, you have more scarcity, prices are going up. We have, as one of the, Jennifer Hernandez in the film talked about some of the environmental regulations. We have legislatures that pass things like solar roof initiatives, which add $10,000 to $20,000 to the cost of a new home. And then they wring their hands over, well, why is housing so expensive in California? We have the California Environmental Quality Act, which has been used and abused to prevent developments for reasons that have nothing to do with the environment. And even the government has kind of recognized this when Governor Gavin Newsom was pushing the Project Home Key. They exempted the hotels and motels that they were using to convert to permanent supportive housing. They exempted those types of projects from CEQA review for this very reason. Well, if it doesn't work for them, it shouldn't, it doesn't work for anybody else either. So there are a lot of things that we can do, but those would be kind of the lower hanging fruit, and then the substance abuse and mental health mental illness issues are going to be kind of the most difficult long-term problems to address.
Thank you. Tom, there's a lot of talk about homeless people being service resistant and being offered everything they need but saying no. How true did you find that when you were living on the streets?
Well, okay, so that's a tough question. It's hard when you're struggling with addiction. Okay, so when I was out on the street and I was struggling with addiction and someone came up to me and said, hey, do you need drug treatment? Are you all right? And I'd look at them, and I'd look at them like, what's the matter with you? I don't have a drug problem. I'm just out here chilling. I mean, honestly, that's what I would say, right? So there is some service resistance in a couple of different ways. A couple of different ways you can look at this. One, you have people struggling with addiction that don't want to let go of their addiction. They're not ready yet, right? Then you have people that have distrust of the system because they've been part of the system for a really long time, the criminal justice system, whatever. So they have PTSD from that. So they're not easy to trust. So there is some truth in going out there and building relationships with people. I agree with that, okay? But there's also a subset of people on the street that would benefit from intervention. Look, I know a guy that's out on the street. He was out on the street 4 years ago. I saw him the other day. He's has massive late-stage addiction, suffers from schizophrenia, and has necrosis on both of his legs. Okay, his legs are literally rotting off of his body. He should be intervened on and put in palliative care. Instead, he's sitting on the street corner smoking crack. That is not compassion. That's not being service resistant either. That's being sick, and he needs help. So there's a few different things you have to look at, and you have to look at each situation almost individually. But the idea of service resistance, to me, is rooted in two things, mainly distrust of the system and drug addiction. Those are the main things that drive that. So if we can address that in a way where we can come at them with real treatment on demand options for people to get them into a bed, into a detox bed the same day, I think we can make tremendous progress on that. But again, it's about resources.
Yeah. And Theo, if the Salvation Army is able to successfully redevelop its properties and build out the 1,500 new beds with full wraparound recovery and workforce development, how quickly do you think you can fill those? Is there plenty of demand, and how is that going to practically work to get people inside?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, similar to what Thomas was saying, there's not sort of a line of people waiting to get into facilities. And it's, for all the reasons that he mentioned, it's troubling. And most of the work that we do, really, I like to say we're in the business of people, right? From the folks who work at the Salvation Army to the people that we serve. And a lot of what we do is this idea that hope can be restored in an individual, and that we can restore hope, we can restore dignity, and not sort of encourage dependency. So the beds are one piece, but the transformation comes when they're housed with us for 2 to 3 years. How many folks, just out of curiosity, how many folks here have lost a job for 6 months or longer? Right? Like when month 6 rolls around, you're pretty depressed and in a dark space. So if we can address sort of the joblessness, the loss of a job, put folks back in the workforce, if we can address the substance abuse issue, if we can address the mental health issues, if we can provide folks with a environment that is not sterile, we have an opportunity to really transform lives at scale. I'd like to say there are not a lot of organizations that have the social agency or the geographic reach or the history of service. If you look at the Salvation Army, we really check a lot of boxes. The folks that work at the organization are called to do this work. We're one of the largest providers of substance abuse treatment in the United States. We serve every zip code across the United States. So if we get this right here in San Francisco, and we're able to provide a full continuum of care to take folks from the streets all the way to permanent housing, we can get that right all across the United States. So we've got a real special opportunity.
If I can just jump in real fast, when we first started talking about the way out, the man who worked at the Salvation Army and had been doing street outreach to the homeless for years, when he heard about the idea, he was just like, if you can show people that there's actually a path with an end point that gets them on to their full potential, it's a game changer. Because right now the programs are, sure, you can go into detox or recovery, but when you're finished with the program, you're back on the street. So people give up. But if they see this is really a path, this is the way out, they'll be interested.
And I wanted to throw out a question to anybody who's from San Francisco. If you want to talk about what you think of Mayor London Breed's emergency declaration in the Tenderloin and how it's going. Just before Christmas, she announced an emergency declaration and a 90-day big effort to curb drug use, drug dealing, and crime and other issues in the Tenderloin.
Okay.
I'm looking at Thomas. So I'll go after Thomas. This is going to be a good one.
Before I answer that question, I just want to tell everybody, I graduated from a Salvation Army drug rehab program, and that program was a 6-month inpatient program, and it ended my homelessness. But the big challenge that I had was where I was going to go after I completed that program. So that's one of the things we really need to consider. The emergency declaration in the Tenderloin is a good idea. It deserves it. That community has more children in that community than any other neighborhood in San Francisco. The folks that live in the Tenderloin don't deserve to have 24-hour organized drug dealing happening on their streets. Last year in the Tenderloin, they pulled 26.6 kilos of fentanyl off the street just in that neighborhood. That neighborhood deserves more. So she's right to do the emergency declaration. The implementation of that declaration has been a little bit bumpy so far, but there's still a couple of more months to go. So I think it would be wise to reserve judgment and wait to see how it goes. Are they, that linkage center is serving about 2,000 people a week right now, which also shows you how large the crisis is just in the Tenderloin and mid-market areas of San Francisco with homelessness. But that linkage center has also only placed 4 people into drug treatment during that same time. So we need to improve those outcomes. And that's something over time, hopefully, that I think, I'm hopeful that will bear some fruit. But they're going to have to make some changes too along the way, because the way they're going about it right now is, I think at the end of it all, you're still going to have those 4,000 people out there struggling with addiction, homelessness, because there's not enough resources. There's no incentivized treatment out there to try to coax people into treatment. And again, to bring it back to what we're doing here at the Salvation Army, I think you guys are doing great to offer an incentivized treatment option for people. Because when I was on the street, that was my daydream, was to be able to get a house and get my own place. Now, at the time, I was like, it was to get my own place so I could do my drugs alone. But, in recovery now, having a home to go to, that makes all the difference in the world. So,
I want to answer that question because, when COVID first hit, there were, and nobody's going to talk about this, and Heather, I think you will appreciate this as a columnist, but when COVID first hit, the mayor implemented an emergency order to amend the way services were provided and how quickly the government could get contracts out, et cetera, et cetera. We were fortunate enough to be able to pivot very, very quickly and serve meals. We went to 50 different encampments 7 days a week. And to date, we've served over almost 500,000 meals to unhoused residents across the city and county of San Francisco. And I bring that up because I vividly remember, and I know Major Matt is in the audience here, I vividly remember pulling the box truck down to the Tenderloin, and we rolled up our truck, and people came over for food, and I looked across the street, and I saw kids, this elementary age kids from our Croc Center being escorted from school by the police, from school to the Croc Center, which was roughly 2 or 3 blocks away. When that is the image that our young people are seeing, something has to be done. So emergency order was absolutely necessary for the Tenderloin. And Thomas was right that it's obviously going to have to be changed and it's obviously going to have to be amended. But we don't do that by way of the ballot box. So I think this is going to cause a chain reaction of political moves from the other side, if you will. I think we're going to see, there's talk, sort of the rumor mill around what this emergency ordinance, the implication it has for surveillance, the implication it has for funding to the police. So I think we might see something, June's coming up, and if the negotiations don't go right behind the scenes, I think we may see something on the ballot. And then it also, this idea of ballot box budgeting or ballot box legislating doesn't really sit well with me, but I think we're going to see something around homelessness as well and the right to shelter. And you're going to have the progressives again versus the moderates trying to figure out how we solve this crisis. And at the end of the day, it's the folks on the streets who are left suffering. So it was definitely needed, but I think you're going to see a ripple effect in San Francisco politics.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Good? Okay.
That's good.
Just to give a little context to what Tom said, the amount of fentanyl pulled off the Tenderloin streets last year alone, one little neighborhood, it's so deadly, a couple of crumbs can kill you. It's enough to have killed the entire Bay Area population. Wow. So we'll end with a quick hopeful note. We'll start with you and go down that way. If you can each say one sentence of what keeps you hopeful that the homelessness crisis in San Francisco can improve. if you want to start.
Well, what keeps me hopeful is my fellow panel members. You've got dedicated people that are looking for solutions, and it takes leadership, and that's the start of it. The other thing that I wanted to say that I was remiss in not saying earlier is we have to look at how we're investing as well. Simply investing in homeless intervention is not going to end homelessness. The federal government, HUD, is saying we're going to end homelessness. You don't end homelessness simply by investing in homeless intervention services. You have to invest in upstream interventions. If you don't have access to affordable housing, if you're not mitigating issues of poverty, you're not going to end homelessness, period, the end.
What keeps me hopeful is when we engage with new organizations that join our alliance, and I see the talent, expertise, and energy that they are ready to bring to address this issue, and they've kind of just been waiting for someone to engage them. And that gives me hope as I think about all the other people that we can engage. We're excited to announce and launch our alliance on March 2nd, 2 weeks from now, and be ready and excited to share a lot more at that time.
What leaves me hopeful, two things. One, that there's finally a lot of money coming down the pipeline to solve this crisis. The downside to that is that I think there's a small window of opportunity to get this right. Like we're using dollars to solve for now, but I worry about what's coming next. The budget in San Francisco, I think we're going to see some pretty harsh reality sort of hit us pretty soon. The second thing that keeps me hopeful, I know we were supposed to keep it in one sentence, but the second thing that keeps me hopeful is all of the folks, and we saw this with COVID, how the city and nonprofit organizations responded to COVID quickly, swiftly. We're starting to see that same thing with homelessness. I saw Gail Gilman earlier today. There's a regional strategy finally happening in a way that I think will finally make a difference across the entire Bay Area. So it's the money and the people that leave me hopeful.
I don't think this is something that's going to be effectively addressed from the top down. What makes me hopeful is that I think there's a greater recognition amongst the public in general that the way that we've been doing things is not working. We need to try a different approach. And I think you will see, as often happens, the politicians will probably lead from behind on this. But I think it is going to take dedicated nonprofit organizations and members of the public to really push change. And it was only in the last few years or so that homelessness started becoming the top one or two issues facing the state. But I think there has been a change, and I'm hoping that we've kind of reached that tipping point. That we will start embracing some of the approaches that you've seen in the documentary and discussed here on the panel.
What makes me hopeful is, as they were saying in the film, everybody I've been talking to for the last 2 years has a great deal of compassion about this problem and is wanting to be part of the solution. So if we can create a way for people to join together and be part of the solution, we'll get a lot of great ideas, we'll get a lot of great energy, and we can make a huge difference here.
What makes me hopeful is kind of what Adam said, but I'll just put a finer point on it. At the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, people are recognizing that the status quo isn't working, and they're recognizing the significant contribution of serious drug addiction and serious mental illness as contributors to suffering on the streets. We hear, Governor Newsom, we hear mayors, we hear legislators talking about, the importance of reforming the Lanterman-Petra Short Act that creates such a high bar to get people who absolutely need help to reforming that legislation. We hear conversations and resources dedicated to more adult residential facilities, boarding cares, the kinds of really therapeutic housing that's important. I'm also hearing the same thing in the federal government. We see more and more people talking about challenges like capitations on Medicaid reimbursement for serious mental illness that effectively put a cap on the amount of beds and the amount of treatment that states are able to provide. And when you don't have anywhere to go, you go to the streets. So people are starting to recognize exactly what's going on and the problems. They're rejecting this notion that homelessness is strictly an economic issue, and they're also rejecting this notion that permanent supportive housing is some kind of panacea that can solve behavioral and health issues. And I think those are really good things happening.
Well, I'm hopeful that, you know, because of a lot of advocacy of a lot of people, some of them are in this room, we're beginning to change the narrative around the homeless issue, the drug crisis that's affecting our state. You know, there's 161,000 homeless people in California. It's probably closer to 200,000. That's a lot of people that we have to serve and then we have to try to save and help, and we have an obligation as a community to do so. So I'm really grateful that this issue of homelessness has become the issue in California right now. It is the #1 issue in California, and it's backed up, you know, after COVID, it's backed up with the overdose deaths right there, because the two, unfortunately, are intertwined. So I think it's great that we're raising awareness. It makes me hopeful that we can change the narrative and make some real substantive change on this issue.